Welcome to Sacred Stream Radio with Isa Gucciardi. Today, Isa discusses Buddhism and the nature of suffering. This material is from a talk on Buddhist psychology.
This talk is about Buddhist psychology, and I'd like to just start with talking about what is Buddhism. And I think that most people think that Buddhism is a religion. And of course, it is a religion for many people, but actually, as a religion, it is more of an educational system whose goal is the attainment of happiness for all beings. And within the Buddhist context of understanding what it is to be educated, the concept that everything is knowable is a given. And so that's a pretty big statement to have for an educational system. And so what Buddhism does is it provides the student with a series of tools that helps the student come to a place where they can know as much as they can know about their own experience. And within the context of this educational system, this knowledge is transformative. And the evolution of knowledge takes place over lifetimes within the Buddhist paradigm. And so the idea that one is engaged with an education about one's self that takes place over a series of lifetimes, and the point of this education is to increase greater happiness within the self, and also to get to a place where one is seeking to educate in the Mahayana schools of Buddhism, where one is seeking to educate others so that they can find happiness within themselves as well. I think one of the big stumbling blocks that some Westerners have to the Buddhist concept of knowledge taking place over lifetimes is the idea of reincarnation. And, certainly if that is a stumbling block for you, please don't let it stop you from listening to all of the other ways in which Buddhism works, even within a single lifetime, to help the person transform their sense of self through this education that the Buddhist principles provide. One of the really important aspects, if you do believe in reincarnation or if you do suspect that there might be another life, is that the work that is engaged in at this level of education within Buddhist principles of meditation, practice, and study is that this is the work that you take with you as you leave your body and move into another state of consciousness. And this is very helpful when we think about being able to engage in a way that is going to help us over time. And our sense of time changes when we kind of drop into this way of thinking about the evolution of consciousness, the play of consciousness that takes place within an infinite amount of time. And one's priorities tend to shift dramatically as one steps into this paradigm. And one of the goals of this shift is liberation from suffering. And Buddhism has a very clearly defined set of principles which define what causes suffering. And we're going to go over those in a few minutes. And the idea that one can be liberated from suffering is a wonderful, radical idea, I think, for many people, because I think many people in their daily lives find themselves caught in patterns which don't really seem to have an exit. And when you work within the parameters and tools that Buddhism provides, exits begin to open up. But I'd like to talk a little bit about Buddha as a teacher. He was born in northern India in about 550 BC. And he was actually born as a prince in a ruling family in northern India. And he, at 29, decided that after having followed all the rules and done everything his father had asked him, that he was going to renounce the world and he was going to try to find what the root of suffering was. So he abandoned his family and his possessions, and he gave himself up to asceticism. under the directors of masters of this discipline. And after 7 years, he concluded that he was no closer to understanding the nature of suffering than he was at the beginning. So he decided that he was going to continue meditating and working and trying to understand the nature of suffering. And there's the famous story of Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree, fig tree at Bodh Gaya. And he had, after much study, sudden illumination about the nature of suffering and how to help people move out of it. And he spent the rest of his life teaching. And much of what is in Buddhist practices these days, it comes directly from his teachings at that time. In Buddhism, there's many different schools of Buddhism with many different types of emphasis. Some schools emphasize meditation, other schools emphasize practice, other schools emphasize transformative practices. All of them, though, draw from the basic teachings that the Buddha brought forth after this moment of enlightenment under the fig tree. I'd like to give you a few definitions that some of these teachings that Buddha brought forth provide. One of the essential teachings that Buddha brought forward was this concept of Buddha nature. And Buddha nature is this aspect that we all have. It's an aspect of our experience of ourself that is connected to aspects of universal power in an unbroken way. And in Buddhism, it's understood that our suffering, in its essence, is an obscuration of the ability to see our own true nature. And we lose track of our Buddha nature as we, in Buddhist terms, get caught in the winds of karma. And I'm not going to go too far into karma tonight, but in the Buddhist Psychology program and in the relationships program, we go deeply into the nature of karma. But generally speaking, karma is consequences of actions. And so when we get caught up in the consequences of actions which lead us away from our Buddha nature, we find ourselves engaged in suffering. So it's through the process of understanding the nature of our own particular suffering that we are able to find our way back to our Buddha nature. And if any of you who have ever done depth hypnosis, you recognize this idea in the way that depth hypnosis begins with the symptom of an issue and follows it back to the core power that's hidden and is actually even revealed by following the path of the symptom back to the core self. So let's talk a little bit about the consequences of actions and in terms of karma and the kind of suffering that is created as we get caught in the winds of karma. And in Buddhism, there's a principle called the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths are statements about the nature of suffering and statements about how to emerge from suffering. So in the Four Noble Truths, the first noble truth is that suffering exists. Life is suffering, birth, aging, and dying is suffering. And the second noble truth is that we can understand how we generate our suffering through our actions and the consequences of our actions. And the third noble truth is that our actions, when they're taken in the context of either desiring something too much or avoiding something too much or refusing to become conscious of something or simply not being conscious of something, this is what creates our suffering. So the basis of suffering in the field of karma is attachment, aversion, and unconsciousness. And the fourth noble truth is that you can emerge out of these aspects of experience which create suffering by following a Buddhist principle called the Eightfold Path, which is a set of principles that are provided much like the Ten Commandments, but they're much, much more complex. And we're not actually going to have a lot of time to go into that tonight. But again, in the Buddhist Psychology Studies program, we will. So Buddhism really kind of tackles this issue of suffering in a very direct way. And one of the ways that it tackles suffering, beyond what I've mentioned here, is by looking at the nature of the mind. And the primary aspect of Buddhist psychology is the education of the student about the nature of the core self, or about the nature of each person's Buddha nature. Because by coming into contact with one's Buddha nature, that one is able to remove oneself from the different types of afflictive emotions that run through the mind. And this is the essential aspect of Buddhist psychology. And we will be exploring different ways of doing this. We'll be exploring different types of meditative practices that help with the focus inward. We'll be exploring the ways in which we engage in our attachments and our aversions, and the ways in which we are ignorant of certain things about ourselves or certain aspects of our experience. And we'll be working with different Buddhist principles to help us become more aware of ourselves, so that we can emerge out of this suffering that we find ourselves caught in our daily lives. If we were to admit how much our suffering is generated by our aversions and our desires and the things that we're unaware of, we might be willing to really engage in this process that the Buddhist psychology program will help you with, and which all Buddhist practice can help you with.
Thanks for listening to Sacred Stream Radio, brought to you by Red Cow Records and the Foundation of the Sacred Stream. For more information, please visit us on the web at sacredstream.org.